Hey everybody, Josh Sigurdson of World Alternative Media, and of course we're joined by author and economic analyst here at WAM, John Sneisen, and we got a big report here today from Business Insider, the Nordic edition. As the article's headline says, Sweden could be on the verge of a financial crisis, according to experts. And it goes into how Sweden's social life has been financialized, concludes a report published by the think tank Katalys. The financialization of Sweden has been centered on the real estate sector, and since the financial crisis in 2008, Swedish banks have been twice as profitable as their European competitors. And one of the big points to take away from this also is that Stockholm has the second most inflated housing market in the world, according to a newly published report by UBS out of Switzerland. Now, this is really something that is on an epic proportion, epic scale. We are seeing this around the world, but Sweden is really standing out in a lot of ways. We'll go into more ways after, but I mean, what's happening in Stockholm with the housing market, it kind of makes me think of that term, Stockholm syndrome, where people, they grow fond of their captor, and their captor right now is the banking system. And with the amount of people still buying in to way overvalued housing, and then expecting to capitalize on that when really a bubble is forming on an epic scale, we need to really tell the Swedish people who are watching, and I know we have a lot of Swedish viewers, what they can expect and what they should know.
Yeah, no, there's a huge bubble developing in Stockholm's real estate market. It's insane. It's everywhere, Josh. These central banks, what they've been doing is just eviscerating, free markets around the world and completely creating so many bubbles. It's just an epic scale now. How many bubbles there is? There's bubbles everywhere you look now, and there's almost nowhere where there's not a bubble currently. It's completely insane how the central banks, of course in Sweden was one of the first countries in the world to implement a negative interest rate. And of course, if you can take a look at the M0, so you see how much money in circulation has dropped substantially. Sweden is, of course, one of the countries in the world that are working the hardest to make sure that they get into a cashless society. They've been RFID-ing workers. We've done some articles on that. It's a huge push in Sweden to have this global enslavement of the cashless society and like systems with this RFID.
Well, yeah, there's a huge push towards the global cashless system, which China and India are championing most of all. And then Sweden and Australia are kind of tied alongside places like Canada, this mega push towards centrally planned cashless in order to eventually use it as like a test ground to bring into the special drawing rights at the IMF. And I mean, there's articles like this one from BBC which says why Sweden is close to becoming a cashless society. And Sweden is the most cashless society on the planet, with barely 1% of the value of all payments made using coins or notes last year. So how did the Nordic nation get so far ahead of the rest of the world? Well, I'll tell you why. Because people have far too much faith in central planning, in the central banking system, in banksters in general, in government in general, and it just grows constantly. Like I said, it is Stockholm syndrome, and God forbid this continues, because if people don't learn from their past mistakes of fiat, which always reverts to its intrinsic value of zero and then pushes it into a global cashless system, we are doomed, folks. And just one point to make before I pass it back to John is that I always say this: if your money's in the bank, it's not yours, it's the bank's. And if your money's always going through the banks via digital transaction, legal tender laws, you never hold it in your hand.
The bank owns you.
Yeah, the bank owns you. You are subservient. You are in servitude to the banking system and the government, hand in hand in this case, because you don't hold it. All the money you make is owned by the bank. You never make that money. So this is incredibly important for people to understand. It's going to be very epic when it all comes down. They're desperate. As you mentioned, Sweden is in negative interest rates, and just looking at what's happening in the US, they're trying to push those interest rates high enough to be able to drop them out when the fiat system comes tumbling down, which it inevitably has to do, despite the fact that fundamentals are off the table due to the level of manipulation. So you can't put a date on it, but you know it's going to happen. So they're attempting to push it up so they could drop it out, because I think it was 5.5% after the recession in 2008, and it's going to go negative. So they're desperately trying to move to that cashless system.
But Sweden is not. Sweden has been stuck on that negative 5%, 0.5% interest rate now for a long time, and they're just have created a bubble again of epic proportions. Now Sweden compared to Norway, the two socialist countries, they're very different, because Norway had their oil, the massive sovereign wealth fund, which we've gone in great detail on, while Sweden actually had to innovate. They had to create IKEA, Ericsson, Volvo, big massive corporations that are well known around the world, which they've done great with that. They're great inventors, where Norway kind of sat back and just had that oil straw in the ground, becoming lazy. The Swedes had to actually do something in order to create their economy. Now, there's so many problems with Sweden currently with immigration. We could go in great detail, but we're not going to do it right now. And of course, that making a lot of people dependent on the state through welfare payments with this mass immigration from...
At the same time as dividing countless people, so there's infighting instead of fighting these real enemies that are stealing from people on a regular basis.
Yeah, no, there's a lot of problems in Sweden, and there's no-go zones in Stockholm. I've been in Stockholm, and I saw that there were no-go zones there when I was there back, and this is like 10 years ago, Josh, when I was there last time. Things have gotten really crazy in Sweden with all this, and I'm looking at a Norwegian article here that talks kind of elaborate a little bit further on that article that you were saying. They talk about how the Swedish banks are 4 times, like the holdings of the Swedish banks are 4 times of the GDP of Sweden. It's insane how much they're holding on their balance sheets. And what is that? Well, there's a ton of real estate, but then there's probably a lot of derivatives here that those Swedish banks, like one of the biggest ones in the world, the Svenska Enskilda Banken, which is one of the biggest banks in the world, and other banks, of course. It's really interesting what the Swedes are up to, and the central bank. Swedes, I'm going to talk about Swedes, just quickly some history about Sweden, and they were one of the first ones in the world to implement a central bank back in the 1600s, where a guy called Palmstruck, he was the first one before they created it. He created a private fiat currency, and of course that miserably failed. It printed it into a hyperinflation.
Of course.
Then they actually executed him. They executed the Palmstruck, and then about, I think it was 30, 40 years later, they implemented the exact same idea he was executed for into the first central bank in Europe.
History, as Mark Twain said, doesn't repeat, but it rhymes, and we've seen that in the United States as well with the first central bank in the United States, I believe, put in place in 1792 to 1799 or 98. I can't exactly remember. It was pushed forward by Alexander Hamilton, and then the second one from 1812 to 1833, where Andrew Jackson basically signed off on it and said, we do not want a central bank in the United States. And then we saw it repeat again in 1912 into 1913 with the Federal Reserve Act and the IRS Act, which was written side by side with it. And it's been continuing on to this day since the 1970s, printing into oblivion because it's no longer even backed by anything, even though it was bad in the first place when it was centrally planned, even with gold, because they printed out more paper than they had gold. But I wanted to also mention with the cashless system, it's so incredibly dangerous because we also see what banks are trying to push forward with bail-in regimes.
And recapitalization, as they like to call it.
Yeah, and basically it means that they could just take depositors' monies to pay off their crazy debts and etc. And Mario Draghi, which we recently went into at the European Union, has pushed forward this idea of just not insuring almost any of the money that's taken.
And Sweden is a member of the European Union. Now they're not a member of the Euro. Mm-hmm. They have their own Swedish krona, which is actually doing pretty bad. And we talked about the correlation between the Norwegian krona and also the looking at versus the US dollar. Yeah. The Swedish krona actually works exactly like it. I was looking at it, and of course these currencies they kind of predict that something big is about to happen, and of course it is. Also the Swedish stock market, it looks exactly almost like the Dow Jones or the Nasdaq or the Norwegian Oslo Børs, the German Eurostat. Like everywhere you look, all these stock exchanges have been moving exactly the same way. And of course, if you go and look at banks' balance sheets, you see that the central banks have been in there, massively manipulating. Yeah. And you have central banks all over the world starting to buy stocks in different exchanges to help each other, keep this bubble alive.
Yeah, well, I mean, you can get some gum, you could chew on it, it could taste really good, you could blow those bubbles, etc., etc. Eventually it's going to be stale, eventually it's going to pop, and eventually you're going to have to get new gum, and in this case, you need a new monetary system outside of the governing policies of the government and the banking system.
Yeah, don't pick up the gum underneath, things like...
That's basically what history has shown.
That's what the central banks are currently doing. They're picking up that old gum and trying to blow new bubbles with old gum.
And not only is the bail-in regimes a huge problem, which actually is something that's been talked about many times in Sweden. Also, another thing is you can't do a run on the bank. So if there's a massive crash, what are you going to do if everything's cashless? 1%? Come on, people. I know that it's easier that way. It's more convenient. They're pushing that way. There's different stores that only accept digital payments, but something has to give, and people in Sweden have to stand up to this implementation because it's a slow and slippery slope into absolute authoritarianism and monetary enslavement.
Yeah, unless you want to be Greece and Cyprus, which is implemented heavy capital regulation on how much money you can take out of the banks in order to keep the banks from bank run. Mm-hmm. That's exactly what's happening. It's these banks are so massive around the world, and they've gained so much control that they really want to fully enslave you. Which is interesting with Sweden. The Curse of Cash with Ken Rogoff, he's talking about how they could implement negative interest rates after they have a cashless system. Sweden has been doing it already because they're on their way to that cashless system that they want. So that's the goal, though. They want a cashless system so they can implement negative interest rates, because negative interest rates, you would have your money in the bank, you would borrow the money to the bank, but the bank is charging you money for borrowing you that money.
Well, it all
doesn't make sense. But
all comes down to monetary and market manipulation hand in hand. Banking system capitalizing off the debt of the individual. Same with the government. If you're shoved down that bottomless pit of debt, you are forced to ask for a ladder up from the government and banking system, which puts you into perfect servitude, which is exactly where they want you. So let's look at solutions, John, to finish this off. Bottom line here, you want food, water, shelter, self-defense, so you're not gathering things for the toughest guy on the block. On top of that, you want decentralized assets, Bitcoin, gold, silver, diversification of your wealth, have financial responsibility, self-sustainability, don't be dependent, and make sure you understand these very basic things that seem complicated, but they are basic, I assure you. Be aware of these basic things so you can ensure the protection of your family, your loved ones, and of course yourself, and warn your friends. So, I mean, I think that's really important to put a bottom on this report.
Yeah, I got only one thing left to say to my Swedish friends there. Söta bror, det är tid för en revolution.
All right.
It's a revolution. Start it.
Absolutely, and we have to test that revolution every few years, as Thomas Jefferson once said, or else it's just going to be taken over. You have to be responsible. So finishing it off, thanks for going into this with us, John, and until next time, this is Josh Sigurdson and John Sneisen signing out from World Alternative Media. Find the truth,
be the change.
Like what you see here at WHAM? Don't forget to check the links below. GoFundMe, Patreon. We can't do it without you. Any donation is very much appreciated, especially as we are so overwhelmingly demonetized and censored by YouTube as the Anti-Defamation League comes in and flags all of our content as hate speech. You can also find me at Josh Sigurdson at steemit.com. That's steemit.com, the future of social media, where you get paid in the upvote of your post via Steem, the cryptocurrency. You can also find our Bitcoin address in the description and the comments below, as well as on the screen for you to scan if you please. And don't forget to come on down to Acapulco in Acapulco, Mexico in February, one of the best events of the year, and you can save money on your tickets by typing in promo code WHAM. That's WAM. We'll leave the link below for you, and until next time, don't forget to subscribe. This is Josh Sigurdson signing out from World Alternative Media. Find the truth, be the change.